the brief brainstorm around why we were going to do this together, wasn't it? It was because at least I felt that Omar and I haven't had the chance to chat to you, Bex, about all the great stuff that you do and know and have experienced in the women's game. But also because the opposite's also true, which is Omar and I are doing more stuff in the women's game, globally, internationally and domestically. And the thing that we would love to be able to work through is how actually there is only one game. Maybe there isn't only one game. Maybe the women's game and the men's game are separate, but actually people are still kicking footballs around.
Yeah.
And I love now this intersection between how things work in the men's game and the women's game, and where those similarities are, where things work in parallel, where there's ideas for new thinking or otherwise. And so we thought hopefully relatively regularly we can all get together, have a chat, talk about things impacting the industry more generally. And we've got quite a well thought out structure for some agenda topics within reason. Within reason. And we just go ahead and have those conversations. So firstly, Bex, thanks so much for getting involved.
Oh my gosh, so much fun. Two of my favorite people in the industry being like, do you want to sit and chat for like an hour? Hell yeah. Wait, are we allowed to swear?
I think so.
Okay.
We can beep it out if we need to.
I'll really try not to though, because it's the locker room chats that seeped into my
consciousness.
Life.
But also because I love working with Omar specifically because he makes me look really good. And not through the things that I say, just the things that you generally come out. Whenever I have the conversation and someone says, I really love the chats that you and Omar have, I'm like, oh, is there a particular reason? He goes, Omar's just so articulate about it.
We learn a lot from each other.
He's very clever. Also, I feel like I didn't get the memo on the uniform. You guys both have like really lovely round glasses. I do actually have some. You should have told me, I would have brought mine.
When we had the prep call yesterday, Bex, we talked about dress code, but not sort of eyewear.
My bad.
Yeah.
I'll do better next time, guys. I promise.
That's right. By the end of this, we'll all be in black, wearing
my caps, hopefully.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. So if we start the conversation off with how does everyone feel that the season has started off, and how's everyone feeling about the fact now it's getting cold and more miserable and not summertime anymore?
Can we actually go back to what you were talking about the one game thing?
Absolutely.
Would that be okay? Because as you were talking, I just thought, actually, it's so interesting, and that comes up so often in my conversations with different clients or things I read or questions that people have about women's sports in general, but women's football specifically. I think it's really interesting because, like, how we've set up, if you look at different industries, like, I don't know, the medical industry, we sort of have a default that always is men, so we've always done research on men and male bodies, and so then there's like this assumption that you can then use the same outcomes and the results to predict, I don't know, same health indicators for females, but actually one of my favorite doctors, Dr. Celeste Geerstema was giving this presentation once, and she said actually the amount of chromosomes that men share with women is the same amount as chromosomes that men share with chimpanzees. So the fact that we've done all this research on men, and so there's clearly we're all human, right? But we sort of, I think because we've been trained in so many different genres of life, that there's a default of men's, it's very easy for us to then follow and copy and sort of fall into that. We're all human, but we clearly have very different ways. And also in psychology, which I studied, there's a lot more research coming out about really the biological structural differences between men and women, and why then that leads to women being, a little bit more empathetic, and potentially even better leaders now is some of the like leadership research around it. And I think that football falls into that as well. So while it is one sport, and clearly the regulations are the same, should they be questioned? Good one for us to write down in a little journal. But I do think when you look at them as businesses, they are completely different. So you have the sport and the fundamentals of you need facilities, you need training, pitches, you need cleats, you need referees, you need all that, all the same. In terms of marketing, sponsorship, fandom, players, player development, coaching, it's all completely different. So if you look at it from a business standpoint, they are almost, for me, two completely different industries. It's almost like you're looking at the medical industry and, I don't know, the airline industry. That is actually how different I think the men's and women's game is from a business sense.
Yeah, I think it's. I completely agree with that framing. A lot of what you're saying there remind me of the book Invisible Women.
Oh yeah, the data biases.
Yeah, and the idea that women are just small men, which is clearly not the case.
Pinky and pinky.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, a big thing I think that football needs to work out. And I think a lot of it cascades down is what is the audience for women's football long term? Because I think there's a belief that it's younger, more female, more family orientated, which undoubtedly is true. There is, a big segment of women's football audience which is that, and you might tailor your product and scheduling and so on around that. But there's clearly, I think at the moment, a big overlap with men's football fans, and that forces you down a different route around the way that you schedule things and what stadiums you use and alignment between men's and women's clubs, and we're going to get into independent clubs and all this kind of stuff. So that's the kind of business side of it that I think it's still being worked out. I think a lot of people within women's football really want to go after this audience, the family, younger women oriented audience, which should. But I think there is a big opportunity in the short medium term with the existing men's audience, and that's going to create some level of tension, I think. And I completely agree on the performance side. It's like historically had just been, kind of maybe the old facilities that the men's had, or the kind of, share it with the academy or whatever, the men's academy and so on. And that's a complete mindset shift that has to change. But that mindset shift has to come with a commercial opportunity, because you're not going to have owners investing in it. Yeah. And so the whole thing's quite cyclical, and it's very challenging, because there's investment before growth at the moment, and investment needs to come with what the end story picture looks like.
The ROI coming back to you.
Exactly, and I don't think anyone's quite worked out what that looks like, what time frame is, because again, the other big thing, men's football had 100 years of marketing before Sky Sports came along. Women's football is not going to get given that same runway.
Yeah, that's a long time, isn't it, Omar?
Huh? But Omar, to your point, is there that overlap between the supporters of men's and women's? Maybe you can talk. Bex, you've done some great reports for various large companies around this type of thing that maybe we can go into. But my feeling, so we put on a few conferences at Sheridan's around the women's game specifically, around the idea of that overlap, and we had one of the commercial directors of a championship club, women's championship club, saying they made the mistake at the beginning of marketing women's game to the male season ticket holders, thinking that actually they were supporters of the club and not necessarily supporters of the different team, and they obviously didn't get real big take-up. The same you could argue for even Chelsea last season for their semi-final, where they really wanted to sell out at Stamford Bridge, obviously didn't quite get there, even with the help of Arsenal. Juliet and others were sort of pumping that up in order to help support. So the reason I say that is that whenever I go to, for complete transparency, I'm an Arsenal women's fan, even though we support Liverpool. That's caused some problems when I've had conversations in the past. But the reason why I say that is whenever I've gone to Arsenal games and walked around, I literally sometimes just walk around the Emirates a few times, firstly because I got lost a couple of times in which entrance I was going into, but after that it became really useful because you get to see the demographic of person that is actually going to those Arsenal games. And again, the same point was most of those games were scheduled 12:30, so early afternoon, not Sunday, usually as well. The demographic couldn't be anything further away from the male football fan. Now, there were some dads, and I don't want to sort of generalise, but when we're walking around, and that's, I guess, the best type of research to work it out, there were huge groups of girls at games. Lots of young girls and some boys, so brothers and sisters were also going, and there were lots more mums rather than sometimes dads as well, I found. So I found the demographic was certainly split more to the female demographic rather than the male demographic, and obviously then everything else that comes from it there. So, and Arsenal, I guess, are the outliers at that, are doing it well because they can sell out Emirates and not many others can sell out. So I don't know where you want to take any of that.
No, I think it's a super interesting question, is all about the audience and the fans, because that is basically, besides the players who are the number one stakeholders in football, which sometimes we forget, the fans are the number two, right? And what I think when you just reel it back a little bit, is looking at how we've started marketing the women's game, that some of those marketeers early on, they were heavily biased. So they felt that, well, if we're going to be watching women's football, it should be young girls watching women's football because those are going to be their role models. Now that is an assumption based off of something like, for example, called the familiarity effect in psychology, which is we like things that we're more familiar with. So I'm a female, so I like watching Nicole Kidman rather than Tom Cruise. That's actually not true, but but I can see myself becoming a Nicole Kidman. Also not true. Terrible example, Bex. But yeah, so I prefer things that are more similar to me. I prefer things that sound like me, look like me, act like me, and this is why we have a fear of change and fear of things that are different from us, right? So I think when you look at like the original marketeers of the women's game, those like fundamental biases that they kicked off the game with are completely wrong, in my opinion. So the dadvocates thing drives me absolutely bonkers. You know, it's dads bringing their young daughters. Well, my partner is a woman, single mother, has a son who is also a Liverpool fan. You'll be happy to know, Dan. Loves Chelsea women, right? Go Dex. Loves Chelsea women, and she was the one that got him into women's football. He sees no difference between the men and the women playing football either. I also think that there's a much wider variety of fandom for the women's game, which is the reason why I say the women's game will be bigger than the men's eventually. Because when you look at the fan base of men's football, let's talk about specifically in the UK, it's quite toxic. You know, I don't always feel safe going to games. You look at what happened in Wembley, the final of the men's versus the final of the women's Euros, back-to-back years. There was a lot of violence, there was a lot of fear. There's kids out there that are traumatized from going to the men's game, right? It doesn't happen in women's football. When you go, you see a lot more variety, you see a lot more kids, you see a lot more actually really elderly people, like a lot more grandparents, right? How many people have come to me and been like, my granddad is obsessed with women's football, like he won't shut up about it. And I was like, that's a really interesting study, maybe we should look into that. But I think like when you actually look at the data and the statistics around audiences for women's football, number one, they're much more diverse. Number two, they are a lot less discriminatory. So there's less homophobia, less racism, less discrimination across the board in all of it. And it's really celebratory. It's a lot more positive. Like even when you take sentiment in media of women's football versus men's, and you do these studies, Omar, which would be fascinating to hear what you think in terms of like a data-driven study on this, it's just a lot more positive. So more positive, more diverse, which captures more people. And I forgot the other thing I said.
Well, it all sounds very good to
Yeah,
me.
perfect.
I think one thing to speak about though is there is a potential distinction between the match-going fan, which I completely agree with, and you go around, you know, whenever I go to women's games, it is that younger, more diverse and so on, versus the fan that will habitually watch on TV each week, will pay a subscription, and will kind of have the continuous emotional investment in a team rather than really enjoy a big day out. And like the atmosphere at women's games is brilliant. I absolutely love it. I mean, I was at the women's Euros final. Is maybe the best sporting event I've ever been to in terms of just that kind of sense of feeling.
Really?
The ground is phenomenal.
Even better than cricket?
Well, that's a whole other thread. But it was just, you know, you felt the kind of sense of warmness to your point, of positivity around. Even when Germany came back in, there was a real kind of sense of positivity. And so this is the thing. So if the audience today, if you've got that younger, more diverse audience, different audience in the men's game that is prepared to pay subscriptions, watch it week to week, then you can do some really interesting things around how you market the game and how, again, scheduling is such a big issue within women's football. So the 3 p.m. kickoff debate, like should women's football sit at 3 p.m? I think if you take a view that women's football is very different to men's football because it appeals to a different audience, yes, it's the same sport, but it's kind of completely different, then I think there's a very strong case to schedule it at 3 p.m. because you're not getting into the issues around diminishing the men's pyramid, you know, kind of treating it as a kind of zero-sum game. But
Can we on the 3 p.m. one, can you explain that, because some people don't understand?
Yeah. So there's a UEFA rule, I think it is, and Dan can get into that, around countries are able to protect a certain time slot within the week, and within England and Scotland, which I think are the only two countries that
There's
protect.
a couple more. There's one
Okay.
more. It's going to come back to me in a second. Keep
Fine.
going.
It was helpful to have the lawyer in there.
But
To not know the answer.
yeah, you can block out a time. I think it's 2:45 to 5:15 here in the UK, where no football of any league can be broadcast, and the idea is actually to protect lower league attendances. Because that's the majority of time where lower league matches are played.
So don't watch it on TV, which means you have to, if you want to see football, go to a
game.
match, right?
Or pirate the game, which
Yeah.
is obviously a whole other
Nobody does
issue.
You've got a lawyer here. So
Yeah, exactly. But historically, that's been blocking men's football, right? Like you couldn't watch, and that's why La Liga historically have scheduled Real Madrid Barcelona sometimes at 3 p.m. because they recognise, well, there's no big Premier League matches on at a time, and actually it's an opportunity to schedule a big La Liga match at that time. Now the question is, as I say, it's been men's football. Could that be a slot where women's football could be broadcast, where it's an opportunity for people to watch women's football? And again, if the argument is that it's a different audience, then it's not the fan that's currently going to watch, Carlisle or going to watch whoever, lower league football. It's a completely different fan that you're not taking away from the lower leagues.
Because there aren't any in women's football.
Yeah, well, exactly.
No, there are.
Yeah, but
Yeah,
you know what I mean, and therefore it's the point around kind of growing the total audience for football. But if it is a big segment of the men's fans today, today you're not gonna, that fan that's watching Mansfield on a Saturday 3 p.m. he's probably not gonna go, I'll watch Arsenal women instead at 3 p.m. Probably not. But the next generation of fan might, and that causes an issue for men's football in the long term around the diminishing of the lower leagues, which is already a kind of a hot topic in the men's game. So that's again, like, accessibility, visibility, discoverability of the women's game is massive. We've seen this, like, Women's Champions League is a great example. It's been sat on streaming platforms for the last 4 years, and to be honest, I would like to watch it. Sometimes it just forgets on.
Yeah.
And
It's the signposting that's really, and I did a report for YouTube on this, which is specific. Jeez, that word is so hard to say. Which is the Women's Champions League. So, what is the value and impact of having the Women's Champions League free to air on YouTube for the first 2 seasons? And one of the biggest results of that report that we did was that the discoverability was way too low. So people just did not know. And I'm a massive women's football fan. I didn't even know it was free to air in every game, but the impact and value of it was still massive for different stakeholders, including players, let's say, from Iceland who never had any agents being able to see them play, all of a sudden being able to play in Spain or, top leagues around the world. So it did have a big value, but discoverability was a big issue. One of the questions I wanted to ask you, Dan, was something you mentioned, Omar, about the regulations and regulatory statute, procedures and structure, is that I hear this quite a lot, and actually working at FIFA and UEFA, actually, we always copy what the men do. So we set up regulations for the Men's World Cup, and they got put on my desk, and I went through and I was like, half of these don't even make sense. Stadium requirements for the Men's World Cup, for an under-17 Women's World Cup in Papua New Guinea, or actually that was under 20. It doesn't make sense. And also things like we didn't have a coach's room where the male coaches could go, so they were having to hang out in the women's dressing rooms. Well, you're just breeding a potential for disaster there, right? So in terms of regulation, and this is what you deal with quite a lot, Dan, anytime I have a question about, what is actually legal, because I would like to do this.
Why do you make it sound all geeky? That's the only reason you come to... Anyway, keep going.
It makes me feel smart.
A bit shady as well.
I'm the shady one, he's the geeky one. Perfect. It makes me want to be geeky.
At least we know the name for the podcast now.
The geeky, shady kids. But the for example, the MCO model, the multi-club ownership, they're looking at that now on the men's side, potentially opening it up, because currently you can't have 2 clubs playing in the Champions League against each other if you have the same owner. If they change it on the men's side, the talk is, well, then they'll just change it on the women's. My question is, why would we even start with a restriction in the women's? When your whole point is accessibility, discoverability, and visibility are huge challenges in the women's game. Why do we start with all these restrictions that the men's game already has and then try to loosen them up? We should really start with a regulatory structure that is completely wide open, and where the men's game was 100 years ago, and then start restricting when and if we potentially need to. Thoughts on that, Dan, as the geeky one in the room?
Got to say something interesting now. Well, I actually think there's always loads of overlapping elements, and some of them are the stuff that Omar and I have chatted about previously. I think one is this point around visibility of the women's game versus the men's game. We've listened to some interesting podcasts around Sky Sports, for example, doing it well on the WSL side, but that's because they've got a huge marketing team on the men's side, so you cross-sell really well. DAZN and others don't really have that possibility because, for all the reasons that we can talk about in due course. The other side also, like anything, is usually regulatory change happens on the whole. Substantive regulatory change usually happens after controversy happens. You never usually get advanced regulatory oversight for the good of the game. It usually works because there's been something that's happened, which means you've got to plug a hole, generally. And that's what happened with multi-club ownership back in the day with the ENIC case, where UEFA wasn't necessarily thinking that this was going to be a big issue back in the late 1990s, early 2000s or otherwise. Now, if we talk about multi-club ownership or otherwise, it's been in the press in the men's side because of Nice and Man United, because of Aston Villa and Brighton owners are holding different stakes in various clubs that are competing possibly in the same competition or otherwise. And certain owners have either divest, which is remove the ability to have influence, control or decision-making capabilities across two teams, or actually in the most recent case actually to put into a blind trust, which has actually been the case. Now, I think the overarching reason is a good reason, which is if I was to say to Omar, based on everything that we've talked about previously, what is the most important underlying concept in sport and in football, it is the integrity of the game and the perception of the integrity of the game being fair and not subject to any either untoward behaviour or actual match fixing or otherwise, or incentives being misaligned. And one of the major problems with integrity or the perception of integrity and misaligned incentives is, one of them was in the past actually, if everyone remembers, third-party ownership, which was investors having stakes in football players banned by FIFA. And then the next integrity issue has always been around ownership of two clubs playing in the same competition. Well, how does that impact on one club and one club's fans? How does that impact on other teams, and how that would deal with things like competitive balance and other things that we're going to talk about? So the perception of the integrity of the competition is the absolute underlying foundational benchmark of any league. If that begins to be questioned, whether it's domestic or international or otherwise, you have a major problem. And that's why the popularity of some leagues, I presume, is greater than others, because at some point there is a fundamental belief in the integrity of the system. If that falls away, then you potentially have a few more problems.
So, like, which leagues would you say, based on that, do you think are not as popular because you think there's maybe a belief that there's less integrity?
Oh, well,
are there any examples of that?
I've no idea. I mean, you only need to look back to the things that have come out in various leagues around match fixing or referee issues or owners and conflicts of interest, all that type of stuff.
I watched Peaky Blinders, so I know that they used to pay all the referees in England.
Well, whatever goes on Peaky Blinders must be the case.
I'm pretty sure it's true, you guys. Yeah, okay.
So I think, thank you. But that's also, I'm sure, Omar, I'd be interested in your thoughts on it, because that integrity piece leads on to a competitive value piece, competitive balance piece, which leads on to a value piece, which then leads on to an attractiveness of product argument, I guess. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think our belief is very much that the quality of the product is the fundamental long-term driver of commercial success in a sport. You got to shape your product around what an audience wants, which gets into the question we were discussing earlier around what is the audience for women's football. But fundamentally, we break it down into three areas. You need to have quality on the pitch, like fans are inspired by high-quality action. You need to have jeopardy, so genuine uncertainty of outcomes, which comes with the integrity piece as well.
Uncertainty of outcomes. In other words, Man City's not going to win the Premier League every single year.
Exactly.
Or Chelsea.
Or on a weekly basis. So that's the thing. It's like it's part of the product is jeopardy, either short to medium to long term, I guess.
Yeah, and it has to matter. It's uncertainty with high stakes. Right. Uncertainty with low stakes is kind of irrelevant.
Yeah.
Get onto. And you need to have connection. You need to kind of be emotionally invested in the personalities, the stories, the narratives, and so on over the course of the season. And jeopardy, as you say, is a kind of fundamental differentiator for sport. Like if you're watching a film, yes, you can be thrilled by a film, but it's got a different feeling to watching sport, because you know that someone out there knows what the ending is of this film, right? Whereas when I'm watching sport, like no one knows. It's only live once, which I think was a great phrase from Sky as a marketing phrase. And the challenge with women's football at the moment is to the point around the men's game. Like pretty much, I would think that every men's professional club now has a women's, maybe not professional team, but certainly not professional team, but certainly a women's team. So you've kind of got all those kind of players spread out across the pyramid within, take England for example. But you're having some teams invest a lot more than others, and you have this competitive imbalance within the women's game. And if you take the WSL for example, the gap between first and last, and we're speaking after Chelsea played Palace on Friday night. Palace just promoted to the WSL. They beat them 7-0, and Palace put up a good fight for 45 minutes or so.
And they recruited quite a lot of players.
Yeah, exactly.
They had
So
some of them,
even though they've
most of the
invested,
transfers,
even though they've invested, 7-0, it was very unlikely Chelsea were ever going to kind of drop points in that game. And then once they took the lead, it was almost kind of guaranteed. And the gap between first and last in WSL, if you look at our models, is kind of roughly the gap between first and maybe mid-table championship, maybe even lower in the Premier League. So you're talking about 12 teams. That's actually spread in the men's context over the course of like 30 teams or 40 teams or so. And so that means a game like Palace-Chelsea is not that watchable. Like you can't watch that type of game week in, week out if you know Chelsea are going to win. So that's an issue that requires raising the floor of the WSL, whilst not. You want the ceiling to rise as well, because you want the WSL to be internationally competitive. English teams haven't won the Champions League, etc., etc.
And you don't want to thwart the growth of the Chelsea, Arsenals, and Man United
exactly,
either, right? Yeah. Okay.
And so you've got this real challenge of trying to raise everything, but making sure that the floor doesn't get left behind. But Palace want to be able to invest, but where's that growth coming from? If it's Chelsea, Arsenal getting all the sponsorship money, the TV money, the UEFA money, etc. So how do you incentivise a Palace to invest in that kind of thing? But at the same time, you want compelling races up and down the league. And actually we've got these rankings on our website, World Sports Rankings, and the WSL actually ranks as one of the best leagues in the world for title races.
I saw that.
Pretty much certainly in the last few years, the title race has gone down to the final day, partly helped by it's a shorter season, so more likely to be balanced.
Emma Hayes basically said, was it 3 matches days before the end? She's like, it's over, we're out of it.
Exactly,
then,
It was a phenomenal end to last
we won
season.
again.
They,
it was really
they lost to Liverpool, thought they were out of it, then they bumped up their goal difference with that win. Was it Bristol City, I think they played?
And they needed the goal difference.
Exactly, which was great. It was really exciting to watch. But in that Bristol City example, you kind of get to the competitive imbalance bit where they needed to win 7 or 8 nil.
27-0.
Exactly, and they actually could.
Yeah.
Whereas in the men's that's part of the challenge in the
Well,
women's
if you
game.
remember, that's what happened to our detriment. Liverpool away Crystal Palace.
Exactly.
When we're thinking Liverpool need to bump their goal difference up in order to get ahead of Man City on the goal difference, and you end up seeing Luis Suarez cry at the end of the game because we get a chance to go 4-0 up and end up drawing 3-3. I think Gale that scored one right late at the end or otherwise. But that's the same point, isn't it? Whether that's the same point in inverse remains to be seen. But on the competitive balance point, maybe that is. I think you're exactly right in raising the floor becomes really, really important because it's like the title film of that NFL game, NFL film, which is Any Given Sunday. Yeah. You want on any given, in the women's and men's, it's either Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, any given day, of those. That you do want to be able to have the possibility of whether it's called an upset or whether it's actually called the possibility of competing. That's what you really want to be able to have.
And the only way, let's be honest, the only way you can guarantee that. Well, not the only way, but one of the key ways you can guarantee that is closed leagues, because the challenge for
which means there's no relegation and promotion.
Exactly, and the challenge for Crystal
Which,
Palace,
if you bring that up in this country,
is very
people do not like it.
exactly. And
what?
But you joke.
That's not sport.
But you joke because the inverse is Super League.
Well,
so
this is the thing.
that's what Super League you have on one side, controversial and struck down by everybody, but actually that's precisely the US model that's worked pretty well.
Exactly. And
so that is the model in NWSL in America, for example, and in all of the major sports leagues in the US.
And if you're telling Crystal Palace, we want you to invest to raise the floor of the WSL, Steve Parish, with some justification, is going to say, well, I can get relegated, and I probably will get relegated this year, so I'm going to spend all this money to then get relegated into a second division that, to be honest, is not drawing, it's certainly not in the short term, is going to draw huge commercial success, it's not going to deliver a return. So what's my incentive to invest? And you see in NWSL, the gap between first and last at the end of last season was some crazy small number of points. It was like 20 points over the course of 20 odd games, a point a game between first and last. In WSL, it's kind of the gap between first and mid-table, maybe even less than that. So, but we're not going to get, you're absolutely right, we're not going to get a closed system in this country, so really hard to build the environment that encourages investment.
But actually, 2 points on that. Both of your examples are great examples of why we need to look at regulatory systems that are completely different from the men's. So one, do we open it up and close it off actually and have closed leagues, no promotion relegation, maybe just for the next 3 to 5 years in women's? I'm not saying we do, but that would certainly allow for the whole WSL, for example, to really put down money and invest, and it would be much more enticing to investors, 100%.
That's what Daniel Levy said last season, you remember. Yeah. And then there was obviously a lot of pushback
Daniel Levy from
Spurs.
Yeah, Spurs, right.
But I'm the traditionalist here, is that you absolutely, and maybe this is from a male standpoint, you want to have almost that democratic pyramid element, which is anybody can go from second, third tier and then make their way up.
Yeah.
There's the query about investment and everything that goes with that, but usually it's the slippery slope.
Yeah.
You have a 3-year closed league and suddenly it gets extended by a few years, and before you know it, it's actually a closed league.
Yeah, or you keep it closed and you're incentivizing investors to invest, but are you still incentivizing them to compete? Because if it doesn't really matter, you're still going to earn the same amount of money, and you can just keep coming in last. You keep getting your sponsorship money. You still make money in the team. Is that necessarily competitive? But the second point I was going to mention is the MCO structures, the multi-club ownership. Is yet again, we should be looking at doing everything we can to get investment into the women's game in all its different forms. So having a closed or restrictions on the multi-club ownership model in the women's game just doesn't make any sense to me. I haven't found one argument where I go, yeah, that makes sense, yeah, we shouldn't, because there are certainly ways that you said, Dan, where you can close it off and make it fair. So make sure that the people that are on the ground running the teams actually are not crossing over into the other teams, so you can separate them all out, and then therefore you don't have influence over the other teams. You have the ownerships that do, but the decision making on the ground is completely separate. And there was something else that you said that I thought was really interesting. What were you talking about?
Closed leagues.
Closed leagues. No.
Ceilings, floors.
Ceilings, floors. All right.
Don't worry.
But sorry, the one thing I was going to say on it was interesting. You saying like as a male football fan, I feel quite anti pro rel. Comes back to the audience point again for me.
Anti
promotion relegation. Anti closed leagues.
Anti closed league. Yeah.
Pro rel. It comes back to the audience point for me, because actually, if the audience for women's football is actually this audience that hasn't historically engaged with men's football, then maybe they really don't care about kind of the meritocratic up and down. They want this kind of concentration of talent. They want playoffs. They want something different.
I'll give you a good example of that. Angel City, right? So I'm from LA. I love LA. I think it's the coolest thing that I've seen in a long time in the women's game. I've been to some games. The football is nothing to write home about, and that I'm being quite generous in that. And that's nothing against the players. I think they're wonderful. I think they work really hard, but it's not the best football that I've seen globally. German teams are better, Swedish teams are better, English teams are better, Norwegian teams are better. They wouldn't be able to compete on an international level, in my opinion. We'll see when the World Cup comes out, right? Maybe I'm wrong, and that would be really nice. But that team has the highest valuation in the world right now at $300 million post the investment, from Mr. Disney and his wife, Mrs. USC. And I think that what they've done so well is they've tapped into an entirely new audience that just loves the entertainment. So to your point, I don't care, like, going up and down like that. That doesn't matter about them. If I can go to a game and I can watch them compete, and if they win, it's great. If they lose, it's not the end of the world. But I still get to wear all the merch. The players are really awesome. I get to see like all these famous actresses like Natalie Portman and a bunch of other like YouTubers that everyone is crowding around, and I'm like, who the hell is that? And everyone's like, you don't know, it's like so and so from YouTube. I'm like,
I'm saying
really
about you.
old.
They're like, oh, that's Bex Smith.
yeah, right. But they've done so well. They've tapped into a whole new audience that really, like you say, they don't really, their main focus, let's say, is not the football. They're not football purists. They are entertainment. They are people that just want to see women doing well. And I think that's actually a whole genre of an audience that we haven't looked at, is like there are so many people out there with the whole movement of like, you know, restrictions being lifted off women and more gender equality and gender pay gap issues and leadership roles and all the things that are sort of trendy right now, thank goodness, finally, in terms of like allowing women more space in the world. There's so many people that are like, this is a great example of how I can support that movement by just cheering for women, and it's a great role model for my son to watch all these women like kicking ass, and oh my god, 2 of them are moms on the team and their kids are on the sidelines and they're scoring goals and doing slide tackles, and I want my son to see that as well. So yeah, I think that they've done a great example of that. Yeah,
and I suppose I completely agree. The question is how many angel cities can be replicated, in the sense of Angel City's almost acted as a bit of a tent pole. You know, it's attracted almost all, maybe not all of that audience, but a significant proportion of that type of audience within NWSL. I don't know NWSL well enough to talk about the audiences of other teams. To what extent can that exist in European football, where, again, even if it isn't necessarily a men's fan coming over, there's a culture around the game that pervades from the men's sport, from the men's side of the sport, and so could a independent team like a Lewis or London City Lionesses create that type of thing while still being at risk of relegation, and there being this kind of sense that it's just a different sporting culture here? I don't know, and I think it's a really interesting debate to have, and I think you do want to see different models of stuff, because I don't think no one's worked it out, right? Angel City have clearly done an incredible job. To say that valuation suggests that they have got it worked out to a large degree.
Arguably a one-off or very specific to that market.
Exactly, yeah. So there's different models. There's the model. There's
it's not like that. I don't think that can be replicated in anywhere else, to be honest.
But I think there's that crossover of thinking between men's and women's. I always find really fascinating, because obviously Angel City's the commercial outlier, just in the same way that you might argue Arsenal's the commercial outlier in terms of women's game and stadium revenues, and then commercial drivers to a degree, where you're starting to see female-only brand associations. And that's the thing that I haven't always quite got about the comparison, which is female game needs to be sustainable. We need to be able to drive revenues, which is all right, but men's game's had 100 years of being unsustainable, and still is. So,
do you know what? Can we double down on that? I find that fascinating. Like, there's such a double standard. The male football teams, men's football teams, most of them lose a lot. I mean, I'm talking like humongous sums of money, multi-million dollars of pounds in cash, and yet everyone's like, well, the women's needs to be sustainable. I'm like, where does that even come from?
Well, it comes from
all of a sudden now we're going to be a profitable business.
It just becomes the general narrative, which is clubs need to be more sustainable. But that's because it actually I don't think it necessarily comes from a bad place. It comes from
agree with you.
It comes from a good place of football being different, sport being different. Clubs are known as being glory maximizers rather than profit maximizers.
This ego-driven, isn't it?
Yes, but also the incentives aren't. No one's ever going to win a trophy for making profit, and that's always going to be the dilemma, especially for clubs that have strong fan bases that want to win and do well more generally. The challenge, I think, there's loads of challenges. There's loads of challenges on the men's game if it's an independent regulator, or what's happening next for multi-club, or competitive balance, or broadcasting rights, or governance, or regulation. But the big challenge, I think, is that the people that, or the clubs that are having the biggest say on the women's side are the clubs that are the biggest men's Premier League clubs. So the query might be, it was great, I read Maggie Murphy's comments on some of your stuff that you posted on the women's stuff, for example, around how you might not want to use the same parameters as the basis for basing criteria on how money is distributed, how certain criteria is based on the non-usual basis by which you measure male success and all of that type of stuff, which I think is becoming really important. But I think the most important thing is, I heard a great quote which was, and maybe it's wrong, which is, women's football is basically in startup mode. Yeah. Now, in any startup tech business or whatever else it might be, you're going to have serious investment at an undervalue for a significant period of time in order to see what the product is, with a dedicated team, which now Nikki and her team are there trying to get cracking with. And then you go from there, really. The concern I have is that using the standards that are set in the male game might not necessarily be the best parameters, full stop.
Yeah. Well, let's take the male game as unsustainable. I think a big driver of that is, like, fundamentally there's an arms race to win, because there's a winner takes all on revenue. You know, if you win more matches, you get access to more prize money, you get access to more sponsorship, more fans, etc. And that kind of drives the spending on players, which fundamentally drives the kind of loss making. And as a result of that as well, clubs have value based on multiples of revenue rather than profitability. So the kind of pursuit of revenue,
which is crazy.
Which is crazy. It's like,
can you just repeat that one more time?
Yeah, it's mad. I mean, like, in pretty much every other industry in the world, your business is valued on profitability, or I guess
profit. So you take the money coming in, you take out the cost, and then you win money. It's a profit.
Exactly.
However, we just look at overall revenue. How much money is coming in? Don't just totally disregard the fact that the club lost 300 million last year.
Exactly, because the idea is that I buy something at 300 million and maybe I lose 10, 20, 30 million a year, but over the course of 10 years the value of that asset will rise and I'll be able to recoup my losses, because there'll be someone else, as you say, will want to glory, and it's just a totally...
Who will buy the club and you can get it.
Exactly.
It's always been a case with club takeover stuff as well, where it's like, how do you value a club? If you can't value it by the amount of profit that can be made, because really no profit has been made, the other justification is really the central distributions for growth, and that has been driven by broadcast and online streaming. So that tends to be the idea.
And so that whole kind of pursuit of revenue, which drives pursuit of costs in a way, drives the whole kind of unsustainability of the men's game. And the model, as I say, is that winning drives revenue. Now, does that need to be the case in the women's game? I think it's an interesting thought, because
it doesn't in the US.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Exactly, your draft system. You know,
that's the same in the men's
cases,
game as well. Though in the US, it's sex agnostic actually in most of US sport.
Well.
Yeah. You get advantages for losing, which can create some weird incentives, but it works. If you look at the kind of
incentivizes people to be losers.
Exactly, but
that doesn't sound very American.
Well,
about winning.
It's a very,
you said it, Bex. You said it. But
what's interesting, I think, is, you know, take an Arsenal or Chelsea. They're winning. Should they get a greater share of the media rights? Well, they're winning, so they're getting access to. You know, they're filling their stadium a bit more because people do want to see winning teams. They're getting more sponsorship because brands want to connect with them. Why don't we think about any kind of central distributions being distributed to the point you're making around what Maggie said before, around maybe it is around profitability, or maybe it is around player development, or maybe it is around different things that actually support the overall growth of women's football rather than just winning. And that would be a very big move away from what men's sport is, where all central distributions go towards winners. But I don't always necessarily see the need for that, because you don't need an incentive to win in professional sport. I mean, you're a professional player. It was never money that was incentivizing you to win. It was
not when I was playing. No.
Exactly. But it was certainly a kind of an inbuilt sense of competitiveness. So that's where you get into, okay, well, whether the answer is to drive towards sustainability or some other goal, you know, to be debated. But I think the idea of distributing money just towards winners could create issues for the women's game in the long term.
Yeah, that's a really good point, I think, because like when you look at the growth drivers of the women's game, sometimes and in some countries it is the top, the winning, the top number of points or where you sit in the league. But in other cases, surely like an Angel City or San Diego Wave or Kansas City Current, who actually is doing all right now, but they, created their own women's, it was the first women's built stadium in the US, and that's got so much media attention, and so many players are really keen to go there because of the media attention and the marketing around it, and they've certainly done really well without necessarily winning everything. I mean, they have won things before, but yeah, I do think it's a really interesting topic.
Can we change? I can't even say change track, just slightly specifically.
I'm trying to say specifically
mine's the change
today.
track. Because Omar, you guys have done some great stuff as well, and I know Bex has got some thoughts on this as well around player workload and domestic and international calendar to the degree that you're able to chat about, only because it's becoming it was already topical. And then, really interestingly, I find, you're starting to find patterns of specific high-profile players now come out in particular press conferences, and even Champions League press conferences, for example, talking about the number of increased games to be played. It seems to be more on the men's side at the moment rather than the women's, but I'm sure that will come when there are more games to be played, etc., and that calendar becomes even more congested. But you have, as seen over literally the last, let's just say 2 or 3 weeks, Rodri came out first, and then, horrendously got really bad ACL. Alisson at Liverpool, Roberts in the last couple of days has said the same as well.
De Bruyne was saying.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. I think Courtois was a little bit ago as well. So you have some of the biggest, highest profile players in world football coming out and talking around player load and their ability to be able to be at their top performing level for long periods of time, and without necessarily the break that they potentially need as well. Who wants to, Bex?
Well, I was going to say, because I think what's so important and vital in this discussion is not just players are tired and this is how they feel. You have to look at the data, right? And this is where I think what you do, Omar, is so important, because when I was at FIFA, I basically created from scratch the very first report on female footballers, and I did it with our medical team. At the time it was called FMARC, so it was a medical research arm of FIFA. And we sent out questionnaires after the 2015 Women's World Cup, and it had everything from, do you have a full-time physio? Do you have access to your doctor? Do you have to go through your coach? How much support is there around maternity leave? Do you feel comfortable? Whatever. How much do you make? All the questions you would ask about like female footballers, so that we could get some of the data and look at how we could support them better. So ironically, after it was done, I asked to do it with FIFPro, and at that time there was a political issue with FIFPro, so I was told not to contact them, not to talk to them. FIFPro is the global players union that's based in the Netherlands, and FIFA refused to publish the report, so I gave it to my friend at FIFPro. And she then expanded the study and expanded the questionnaire by a few questions, and that became the very first women's football employment report. I think it was in 2017 that was published. And having started that as a baseline, I think has given players a lot more voice in being able to be a part of the conversation. But I also think it's so important to look at really the data around workload, and also in terms of medical, I talked about this from the very start, that we still look at the men's game and what the research that's happening and has happened on men's footballers and male human bodies is still being projected onto the women's side, and that is still completely not the case. That's not going to be beneficial for women. We still don't take into account hormonal changes and menstrual cycles and different things going on in the brain from women to men as well.
Yeah, massively. I mean, there's always a discussion as to whether the WSL, for example, should be bigger, because there's always a feeling it's 12 teams, 22 games, surely it could be more. But actually, the context is the women's footballers haven't had the 20 odd years of, or rather, pathway years of fitness and training and all this kind of stuff. Resilience, exactly, which
physical resilience,
exactly, which has come over time, over the professionalisation, but it's not going to happen overnight. multi-decade thing. So the idea, there's free weekends, there's winter breaks we can eat into, there's midweeks we can play. Actually, there's already, we've seen it, particularly with ACL injuries, which is probably a mix of shoes and not understanding, physiology of women versus men, plus the workload piece, which is clearly an
and less regeneration than the men's get.
Exactly.
We don't talk about regeneration, and a lot of people don't even know what regeneration means. But certain things like eating protein after a certain time after you've worked, like different things like ice baths, all the different supplements you should be taking directly after, so that basically from the second the final whistle goes, you are then on a recovery path onto the next one. And the men's, they go and fly in their private jet back to wherever. The women have to schlep in the bus and then schlep into something else and potentially take a commercial flight or take trains or buses, and that takes a humongous toll on your body too. So it is a very big picture of why there's more injuries in the women's side right now. But I think to your point, it's a lot of it is there was always going to be a crossover, because these players that are playing now that are a little bit older, so the Beth Meads, the Leah Williamsons, the Viv Miedemas, who have all done their ACL, by the way, they haven't had that resilience training from a very, very young age, and yet the workload has gone from here to here,
Exactly.
Super quickly, and they just can't. Whereas the next generation of kids who will be getting, and that's why in the US there's a lower incident as well, because we go to college, we start playing a lot younger, we have a lot more physical training, we do a lot more strength training and sprints training and agility and plyometrics from a lot younger age as females than we do in England. It's basically non-existent. When I went to Germany, when I played for Wolfsburg, I got there in 100 years ago, in 2009. They didn't have a strength program.
Yeah.
Can you even imagine that? 4 years later, we won the Champions League. We were the best club in Europe. And 4 years prior to that, we did not have a strength training program. And I was like, I'm doing my own strength training program. I'm not going to that training. Because I don't want to get injured. Mm-hmm. So we're so far behind in Europe, I think, as well. Sorry to interrupt.
No, it's absolutely fascinating. And I think that it's the classic thing. You don't see what happens between the Saturdays, right? And as a fan and as an administrator as well. Yeah. And this is why having more ex-pros as administrators, I think, is a good move, because actually they bring that kind of inbuilt knowledge of the game that you don't see on a spreadsheet. Take our role, for example. So there's certainly that, and I think sometimes it's deceptive to look at volume of games as well, because the intensity of games is certainly shot up in the men's game. I mean, I used to work at a company called Prozone many years ago that tracked physical performance, was kind of the early pioneers of physical performance. And you were talking, I remember in a period between the mid-noughties and early 2010s, you were talking about sprints and high-intensity runs going up by 30-40% in a relatively short period of time, and that's presumably only gone up more since then. Absolutely certain that's happened in the women's game as well. So you think about, we're just adding an extra game midweek here, or we're just cutting into the summer here. That the stuff that you're adding is not a linear effect, it's an exponential effect in terms of workload. So that's, I think, another thing that administrators have grappled with is where the extra games, there's a sense of kind of tipping point on this stuff. And then fundamentally, you've got this kind of belief that to give to broadcasters and indirectly to fans, you need more content. You need to kind of constantly be serving them with interesting matches, as many matches as possible, which is why at the top end of the women's game, you're talking about Club World Cup, you're talking about Champions League growth, second European competition, WSL talking about expansion.
Bundesliga expanded.
Exactly, you're talking about World Cup's it's now 32 teams. Obviously, it used to be 24. Before that, 16. Now it's 32. Who knows? May go to 48 in the future. You talk about more and more, and it's driving a lot of pressure on the elite players in particular. So your Miedemars and Meads and so on. But at the other end of the spectrum, you have got players that aren't playing enough in the women's game. You've got, you talk about, take Crystal Palace again. If you've got an average player for Crystal Palace, they've got 22 games. Let's say they're not a guaranteed starter. Maybe they're playing 14, 15 games a season. They go out early in the cup, they haven't got any European football, not playing internationals. You're talking about only playing for a quarter of the year, really. And that's a massive issue, particularly if you're trying to drive employment of players and grow, make sure that these players sustain. So that's a massive issue.
So if what you're saying, Omar, we chatted about it beforehand slightly, which is actually there are, if it's Alvarez, who's now at Atletico, or if it's Rodri at City or Fernandez at United, you did a great infographic. I think Oriel did a great infographic on LinkedIn. And there's obviously a recent FIFA Pro study that those players tend to be the outliers of outliers. So whilst that is certainly the case that some elite players are completely indispensable and are needed for their teams if it's national and international, and all of the flying and the lack of recovery and the lack of rest, etc.
And media appearances. So the best play, it's like the top they get the hardest hammer, don't they?
Yes, exactly. And so what I sort of wrote down was, well, if the actual headline of all of this are the outlier players, and if the consequence is some players aren't getting enough time, is the answer, maybe the answer is very obvious, or maybe it's actually counterintuitive, which is the answer that there needs to be a ceiling on not necessarily games, and it might be break periods, but it might actually be minutes per season. So remember a while back, I think it was Son and Mane that were some of the highest number of minutes playing players over a particular season because of internationals and Liverpool and whoever and Spurs doing very well. Is the answer as straightforward as saying something like there doesn't need to be a bottom minimum, like we were talking about before in terms of investment or a minimum standards, but there needs to be a top maximum that from a certain point in time, managers of international teams and domestic teams know that these players are only playing X amount of minutes, and that has to be then managed throughout the season so that everyone knows where they stand. Maybe actually it's too interventionist, and I'm saying something quite controversial here.
It's a good question.
But
it's a good question.
I think that's where it might land, to be honest. I think the big challenge is the top players are ultimately the ones that drive a lot of the eyeballs, and they're the players that want to watch. You take, again, the women's game, a lot of particularly casual fans want to see the Lionesses, and they're the ones that are playing internationally, playing in the Champions League and so on. And so if Man United are in town and they haven't got Ella Toone or whoever, as a Leicester City fan, maybe I'm a bit annoyed, I actually wanted to see Ella Toone, but maybe.
But is that better for competitive balance?
Well, this is the thing, is it better for competitive balance, which in the long term drives value in the competition? Maybe Villa get the upset and actually, Leicester get the upset, I'm a Leicester fan now and I'm more invested because we can beat Man United, this big team, and so on. So, it's the kind of short term. Get Ella Toone, get Rousseau, get whoever else on the pitch in all these games because everyone wants to see them, whether you're
on the marketing side,
exactly, whether you're an opposition fan or your home fan. Versus in the long term, what you're talking about is almost redistributing the minutes. So you can create these other stars that drive competitive balance, drive an interesting product, and so on. And it's constant short and long term, and that's a big short-termism in the men's side is a massive challenge because media rights are sold over 3-year cycles. So you're constantly, as an executive, you're trying to maximise whatever revenue you get within your term. In the women's game, maybe we need to think in 5, maybe 10-year cycles in the way that we market and we sell and we kind of try and grow the sport rather than any kind of CEO, whether it's at a league level or a broadcaster level or a club level, thinking about what can I do within my 3 to 5 years in a job. Actually, I need to be thinking about what legacy am I leaving over a 10-year period.
And I think, to answer your question, Dan, do you put in a ceiling on the number of minutes that players can play? I think that the answer is there's pros and cons to both, obviously, and you mentioned some already, Omar. But it all comes back to the data. So obviously I'm heavily interested in the medical industry. I work with some like AI tech platforms and things because I just wish that they existed when I played, because had you had that capability to input all this data and go, oh, you're at a 80% risk of a left calf tear if you do these exercises and you should do these instead prescriptively. I'm like, that's mind-blowing. See, I didn't swear. That was good, right?
That's everything.
But that's mind-blowing, and we should be trying to implement that stuff. But I think before we can get to that point where we start looking at how we're going to regulate the health and safety of players, or I should just say the health of players, we need more data. And on the women's side, there's even a bigger issue, because on the men's side you have a much bigger pool of players. A much bigger pool of players, and they're playing for many more clubs. Whereas on the women's side, the top players, like if you take the top list of, let's say, the Guardian's 100 top players in the women's, like from 60 below, They'd be kind of, players that may or may not be that well known. They may or may not be that impactful, like an impact player, like a real superstar. Whereas on the men's, you have, I would argue, millions, not millions, thousands, let's say, maybe even tens of thousands. You would know because you've done all that data. On the women's, it's so highly concentrated to such a few number of players. And if you look at the workload of those players, it's so much more variant to the lower players that you were talking about, a Crystal City player, because let's say I play for Spain, I'm Aitana Bonmatí, the best player in the world, plays for Barcelona. I also am in the final of the, Copa de Reina, the Women's Cup there, another cup there, the Women's World Cup final. So I've also played so many more matches because I've gotten to the end of all those tournaments. And I'm the one that everyone wants to talk to in terms of media. So I have less regeneration time because after every single match, I have to be the one standing on the pitch. And it's just so much more highly concentrated. So I think until we get to that point where we're using, and I think AI is a fabulous introduction into sport, and we should be using it much more in a smart and clever way, obviously, to try to track that kind of data, and specifically for women, not based off of men's data subsets. We can't even start that conversation, unfortunately. But I do think it's a really good question to ask, and I think if you had the data that fully supported it, I think players, and you could talk to players and they could understand why you're doing it, I think you'd probably get a lot of players on board.
Yeah, and sorry, this comes back to, again, how a central revenue is distributed, because again, if a club's investing in medical, player development, this kind of stuff, that's good for the long term of the sport. It's not going to deliver them results necessarily on Saturday or even next season,
Voila.
but it will in the long term, and it's good for women's football to have those environments within the game. So incentives within the women's game really need to be aligned towards the long term growth rather than maximising Bonmati's time. In the
and
short
longevity of player careers, because if Aitana Bonmatí is or Alexi Putellas or Viv Miedema or Leah Williamson are such huge star power drivers of marketing and revenue in the women's game, we need to be doing everything we can to protect those players if they stay on the pitch, which may mean we need to play them less, but without that data and the statistics around why are we doing this, just, it feels like a gut feeling, she feels pretty tired, you can't make that decision, and no player is going to say, do you know what, I'm just a bit tired, I don't want to play against Crystal Palace today, I want to play every single game.
But that's the thing, I always think, thinking about that in the discussion you guys just had, I wonder whether there's actually some pretty controversial unintended consequences of sort of capping minutes, for example. You get totally towards the end of the season and suddenly the big final or the big Champions League final or whatever else it might be, title decider, and actually the players only got 14 minutes left in their quota, and then maybe that's
from a sporting standpoint you're really messing with the game,
but actually
it could be quite fun.
Isn't that the controversy that is so endemic in the men's game, not necessarily on minutes, but on every refereeing decision, every particular thing that happens. Maybe there's a toxicity, as you said, in that. But I think on the flip side, when these players are starting to, they haven't called for strike action, but what they've basically said is we're getting close to that. The problem, I think you're right in that approach, is I think you need to be able to articulate what the solution is. And at the moment, there's the FIFA report and other reports, both on, I think that was on the men's side actually, that I saw recently, is there's not an easy solution to it, apart from, are we capping minutes, are we capping games, are we having mandatory rest periods or otherwise, which is actually one of the things, obviously, for that cancelled Chelsea Man U game last week, which obviously is pretty awkward for all concerned.
Which was, just if people are listening and don't know, it's that they scheduled the Chelsea at home against Man United in Stamford Bridge. It sold out, and it was a Sky televised game as well on Sunday, actually knowing that the UEFA Women's Champions League match window was that Tuesday, Wednesday. So they had actually blocked, they normally block about 2 days during the week. It's either Tuesday, Wednesday, or Wednesday, Thursday, I think. It might be just Tuesday, Wednesday now. And so they knew that. So they knew there was a chance that they would play Sunday, Tuesday. So, UEFA coming back and saying, well, no, we're not moving the game because of sporting integrity. We can't move, if you've done that to your... And to be honest, I do understand that. And so now Chelsea is rescheduling their Man United game, which is not that easy because Man United apparently did not want to move their game. Anyway. So
we've got probably about 7 or 8 minutes left.
Ooh.
Anything you particularly want to talk about? We had one more topic that we were possibly going to chat about because I'm just going to do a checklist to make sure we've gone over all that stuff. Which is we talked about calendar workload. This is just the lawyer in me. Thank you. We've actually talked quite a lot about competitive balance and jeopardy. We've talked a bit about independent clubs. You talked about the Lionesses to a degree as well. And I just wanted to end on maybe one bit because Omar and I always like chatting about our club. Which is Liverpool. We're sort of quite transparent, at least to that degree. And we talk, Bex, a lot of the time around almost a growing commercialisation of the women's game, but that being led to transfer fees, to players being out of contract, some of the biggest players being out of contract and moving. I saw Bon Mati recently re-signed. She was possibly going to be out of contract soon at Barcelona as well. Russo moving summer before last on a free from United to Arsenal.
You would know, right?
Exactly. And
did you have something to do with that one?
No comment. And what we're interested in, because it's obviously a big discussion on the men's side, but we can talk about obviously on the women's side as well, is, you've probably got, I would argue, 3 of Liverpool's most iconic and historic players throughout the club's history possibly being able to sign free transfers from the 1st of January if they were to move abroad. Alexander-Arnold, Salah and Van Dijk, who have probably, you'd say, contributed to Liverpool's relative historic success over the last period of time. And where this leaves the club in terms of leverage, negotiation, and renewal. So are they going to let these players run down their contracts? Probably Trent less so, because obviously he's very valuable. Van Dijk performing very well, and Salah obviously doing pretty well too. But I always remember,
every time I watch Mo Salah, I'm like, seriously, still?
What? But to Omar's point that he talked about, as which I always find really fascinating, is there's almost a historic fan bias to be thinking about a player's value in terms of what they have previously done. Never mind what they are currently doing, and never mind how they're tracking for future performance. So I made a note, and it looked like Van Dijk, when he is out of contract next summer, will be 34, just 34. Salah, when he is out of contract at the moment, will be just 33, and Trent is 26 on the 7th of October, so quite soon. Happy birthday to Trent. The query, therefore, being, there's obviously more to why you renew a contract than just current performance. You might want to safeguard future transfer value fee and all the rest of it. But any takes, and it doesn't necessarily need to be on those 3 players in particular, but what would go into Michael Edwards and Richard Hughes and the FSG ownership, to the extent that you feel like you're able to say mind in what parameters would you use for such iconic players to be thinking about renewing? Either is it a 1-year renewal? Is it a 3-year renewal? Is it actually because they've probably been getting those players at an undervalue for maybe the last 2 years or 18 months because there haven't been that uplift on the contracts? What do you think?
Yeah, really complex challenge, because you essentially, if you're giving a renewal, you see the wages as an investment to get a return both on the pitch and in a transfer fee. And so transfer fee unlikely for older players. On the pitch you might get a bit, so you're trying to weigh up that, but that's kind of how you see the investment in wages. And then so the question doesn't become about those specific players, it's like, how do I spend this amount of wages, take that pot of wages that you want to spend on those players? If I were to spend that elsewhere, would I get a bigger ROI in terms of on-field performance plus transfer income? That's fundamentally the equation. And it's tough because in Liverpool's case, those are 3 world-class players. In a lot of other clubs' cases, I think you would release the players. But when you get to that level of altitude in the men's game, there are not many players that can deliver that kind of performance. What I would say is that you've got a new coach coming in now who has subtle differences in the way that they play, and therefore may be able to identify other players in the game that might appear not as good, but actually when you account for style, can do something slightly different to those players.
That's a good point, because it is a different style of players, and it's a lot more possessive base, it's a lot more a bit defensive, sort of keeping the ball in more safe areas, rather than like a more direct approach that Klopp's using.
Well, I read a great book over the summer, which is How to Win the Premier League.
Dex, by the way.
How to Win the Premier League by Ian Graham, a person you know quite well. And a lot of his analysis, based on his time at Liverpool, was all to do with how many extra points or percentages of points or decimal places of points does this player add to the team or the squad. So I'm positive that is what they are trying to work out and work through, and then value that. And at that point, then the query, I guess, becomes is how far over the valuation point is the club willing to go on any given player to be able to actually keep them. I mean, there's obviously a question about actually whether they've decided they don't want to keep them anymore, I guess, as well. So I'm always just fascinated around how that leverage works, bearing in mind a lot of the work that I do can be in that sort of agent and player game. Go on.
Sorry, well, this gets to the point Bex was making earlier around, in the men's game there are thousands of players, so it's actually the delta between a Salah and the next best player actually is a lot smaller than you would often think. Salah's incredible, but you can bring in a player who has a small impact. Whereas on the women's game, if you lose a key player, the drop off is big, really big, and so and that's why I think a lot of investment goes into these star players to get them into the WSL, into your teams, because they are so valuable relative to your replacement level player.
Yeah, and do you know what? When you're talking about this, I can't help but just be a little bit annoyed. Not at you two, don't worry.
That you didn't get the big transfer.
Yeah. Then when I was playing, everyone just finished their contract and you just went on to the next club, which is obviously changing quite a lot now. But what annoys me, and it just is what it is. It's not no one's fault, but the fact that there's so much money going into the men's game and so much money in and around the men's game that they can spend all this cash looking at a 0.1% increase in the bloody performance of the team, when like some of the teams in the WSL don't even have full-time physios, which cost maybe 50 grand, 60 grand a year. And like the amount of millions that's put into some of the high tech around, and I get it. Like if I were running a club that was 350 million in what was Liverpool's revenue last year?
Yeah, it was about
350.
No, it's more close to 600.
600, perfect, amazing. 600 million in revenue, and you're spending X 100 or 10, 20 million on a player. Like of course you're going to want to keep them on the pitch, so it is worth it to invest in that. That doesn't faze me at all. That's pure business. It's just the discrepancy between like what are the base minimums in the women's game that we really do need to implement, specifically around the medical treatment and recovery and medical teams that are supporting these players, versus that. So a little bit off topic, but I have to just say, I think that they're coming back to our regulatory and what are some of the minimums and maximums we think we should be implemented from the regulation standpoint. I do think there has to be some more minimums around like what type of investment needs to go where in the women's game, so that you don't get such a huge discrepancy between the top and the bottom of the WSL here in the UK, for example.
Yeah.
Thank you. My rant is over.
It's a pleasure.
Did that take up your 8 minutes?
Yeah, it was very good actually.
Sorry.
I think it's about 9, but we won't be calling art on it just yet. I think we're basically it. That, so
wait, can I one other thing on transfer?
Yeah.
Because that's really interesting in the last, let's say 6 months. This last transfer, was it this last transfer window or the one before, maybe on the women's, where we're now seeing pretty large transfer fees. Transfer fees that are larger than, I would say, 8 times the average salary in the NWSL for one more than that actually, 16 times that in the NWSL, for example. And I think that's really interesting because, again, going from 0 to now over 100 miles an hour so quickly, I think is not necessarily good for the game. I'm not saying we need to regulate how much people want to pay for players, but certainly when Olympique Lyon came in, when I was playing 100 years ago, and they were paying so much more to players, it certainly skewed the market so that every player wanted to go to Lyon. for the money. Like, they didn't necessarily want the competition in the actual league was terrible. They played, like, PSG wasn't even anywhere near what they were. They beat them 3-0 every single time. And it was like 3-0, and then it went 6-0 to up to 20-0. But still, you'd go play for Lyon because you could potentially win Champions League and you can make a lot of money and whatever. I lost my train of thought. But I think now now that the transfer fees are starting to come into the game, I think what we're seeing is, like, for example, the NWSL, with investment comes a lack of knowledge and understanding about the market. So paying, I think, the 2 top transfer fees right now in the women's game, if I'm not mistaken, Omar, you probably know this better than I do, the top 2 players are, like, I think it was like 700 and 800,000.
Yeah, high 6 figures, yeah.
High 6 figures. Yeah. Into the NWSL, and guess what country those 2 players are from?
The one Zambia was, right? Yeah.
Zambia.
Yeah.
Like, I'm sorry, but what? And that is, I mean, they're great players, don't get me wrong. Are they worth that much more than the entire rest of the market? So the market is so nascent in the in the women's game, and specifically with transfers. I think we're going to see a lot of erratic behavior in transfer fees in the women's game right now.
And do you think that's because of the shallow pool, or
yeah, exactly? There's a bit of that. I also think transfer revenue has become a really important revenue for a lot of clubs in men's football, and I think that is a potential source of sustainability. Not to get back into that in the women's side, because in the short term, a Norwegian club or a club in Colombia, it's going to be hard to really kind of make a club kind of profit making or break even. But actually, if you can develop players and sell players, and there is a market for it, then there's actually an incentive to do it.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Love it. Well, this has been very nice.
Yeah.
Loved it.
Has that been already?
Yeah, I know. We might need to do that again at some point, but I think if there are any listeners out there, if there's particular questions, I guess, because I think what I hope we're trying to do is better than a mishmash, but the idea really is just to have overlapping themes that cover men's and women's game, and I think we've hopefully done a decent job at starting to articulate all of those things. I think there's loads of stuff around investment and takeovers. I think there's loads of stuff around broadcasting and online streaming and how to think about that. And I think what we would love to do is maybe get other guests involved as well to share particular, very detailed knowledge on specific areas of the game more generally, and we'll hopefully try and do that over the next few months. But the idea is every month or two for us to get together and wax lyrical about the game that we love, I guess. Doesn't necessarily matter if it's men's or women's, but think about all of those overlapping themes. So thanks as always for getting on board, and looking forward to seeing you next time.
Yeah.
Thanks both.
Thanks, guys.